مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. منذ أكثر من 50 عاما نشرت صحيفة نيويورك تايمز أوراق البنتاغون التي كشفت مخطط الحكومة الأمريكية الخفي بشأن حرب فيتنام. منذ ذلك الحين والصحفيون يتسابقون على نشر أهم أسرار الحكومة الأمريكية. بوليتيكو الموقع الإخباري على الإنترنت نشر مؤخرا أحد أهم التقارير في الأعوام الأخيرة، وهو قرار المحكمة العليا الأولى حول مسألة الإجهاض المثيرة للجدل. لم يحصل أن ينشر قرار للمحكمة العليا قبل إعلانه رسميا، وهو أمر يعتبر في غاية الأهمية. إذا حصل القرار على دعم غالبية القضاة التسعة للمحكمة العليا فسيكون ذلك حدثا تاريخيا، وهو أن ترفض المحكمة حق الإجهاض في فترة الشهور الستة الأولى من الحمل، الحق الذي يضمنه الدستور. إذا حصل هذا فإن كل ولاية من الولايات 50 ستشرع قوانينها الخاصة بمعزل عن أي سياسة وطنية مؤحدة، وهو أمر يعتبر في غاية أهمية أيضا. لمناقشة سياسات الإجهاض في أمريكا اليوم من المحكمة العليا إلى هيئات التشريعية في أرجاء البلاد، يسرني أن أستقبل المراسلين السياسيين البارزين تود جيلمان وجيسيكا تايلور. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. It was a bombshell, a judicial bombshell, a political bombshell, a social bombshell. It was the leak in Politico, a all-politics website, of a draft Supreme Court decision that would overturn Roe versus Wade. More than 50 years ago, a decision by the Supreme Court that gave constitutional protection to abortion. But now it seems the possibility that the Supreme Court may overturn this precedent is very real. We're going to take a look at both the leak and the content and what it means politically. And I'm delighted to have Tod Gilman and Jessica Taylor to help explain all this. So thank you very much for joining me this morning. So we have multiple stories, the leak and the content of the leak. Let's first focus on the leak. How big is this? How unusual is it to have a Supreme Court decision be leaked before it is released by the court itself? Jessica, let me start with you.
I mean, it's completely unprecedented. When I got the alert on my phone, I just sat there slack-jawed because the court has been shrouded in sort of a veil of secrecy. I mean, you have audio recordings of them. They've resisted video recordings for the longest time, even though our congressional procedures are live. And we did not expect this decision to come down until probably the last week in June, which is when all of the major Supreme Court decisions come down. So to have this leak early, it really sort of started, sort of the frenzy that I was expecting more in June. And then it's also opened up another question of who leaked this. I mean, the decision showed essentially that the court was preparing to overturn Roe by sending the decision back to the states with the conservative justice, the now conservative majority on the court. It was written by Justice Samuel Alito, who was appointed by President George W. Bush, and all of Trump's Supreme Court picks, nominees joined him, Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett. So it just underscored how Donald Trump was able to really remake the court, including two controversial seats, one that, of course, Republicans successfully held open until the 2016 election, and then one with Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat when she died shortly before the election. So it just shows how much the court has shifted, but also that whoever leaked this was trying to get this out. We don't know if it was coming from a conservative within the building that was trying to make sure that the justices adhere to that vote, that initial vote they had taken, or if it was someone on the more liberal side that was trying to get it out to sound the alarm. So it's quite the mystery of almost like, Watergate deep throat proportions, truly.
So it took us 40 years from Watergate to find out who Deep Throat was. Todd, will we ever find out who this is? And do you have a theory whether it's someone from the right or someone from the left who leaked this?
Chief Justice John Roberts ordered the court's security staff, the U.S. Marshals, to investigate who might have leaked it. There is, as Jessica said, it's almost unprecedented. It is unprecedented, except for one small footnote to history, which actually involves Roe v. Wade itself, which was leaked to Time magazine several days before it was going to be announced. But that was only as a favor to Time magazine, which had weekly deadlines at the time. The Chief Justice at the time decided to delay release of the argument of the ruling, which would have meant if they hadn't delayed it, Time magazine would not have scooped the court. As it turned out, they only scooped it by a couple of hours, and that was pre-internet. So effectively, it didn't have anything close to this magnitude. I don't think we'll ever find...
The entire decision was leaked. Like, it was pages and pages.
The entire decision was leaked, but only as a favor so that Time magazine wouldn't be 6.5 days behind the schedule because of their deadline. That's really completely different. As Jessica said, somebody wanted to affect the court somehow. My own theory, I think it makes the most sense that a liberal clerk leaked it, or maybe the spouse or significant other of a liberal clerk who happened to see it sitting around the kitchen table, who wanted this uproar to happen before it was too late. Because as Jessica said, this uproar about the prospect of the Supreme Court overturning 50 years of constitutional right to abortion would have happened anyway once the court issued this ruling. So for the uproar to happen now, in some way, you could see where someone who really hates this idea of the court going in this direction would look at this and say, well, we might as well get the uproar now, and maybe Justice Alito and the other conservatives would get the message that 65% of the country thinks that abortion rights should continue.
Before we get to the content, just one more question on the leak itself. Do you think the floodgates are now open? I mean, is this going to normalize the Supreme Court as the target of leaks, the way the cabinet and the intelligence agencies and everybody else in Washington seems to be open to being leaked?
I'm a little skeptical of that, because these are clerks that are most likely Ivy League grads. They are staring down prestigious law careers. So I think to leak something else, whoever this was, be it conservative or liberal, and I will just note that my former colleague at NPR and legendary Supreme Court reporter Nina Totenberg believes that it was a conservative, perhaps, that leaked it to try to keep the conservative majority intact, worried that one of them would defect. So it took enormous personal risk. And if this person is found by the marshals, their career is effectively over. So I think that just with the court's history, another decision of this magnitude, I'm trying to think what it could be. Although, with the right to privacy, which was, the inherent basis of Roe v. Wade, there were portions of the leaked draft that seemed to indicate that they could be moving toward overturning other rights central to privacy, particularly the legalization of same-sex marriage that only happened a few years ago in the Obergefell decision.
Okay, so let's turn to the content for a moment. It's no big surprise that conservative justices who are in the not even a small minority, but overwhelming majority of the court oppose abortion. Why was this such a big surprise to see this in print? Didn't everybody expect this to be the decision that is likely to come down next month anyway?
Well, for one thing, Chief Justice Roberts in particular has been really adamant about the principle of respect for precedent. It's called stare decisis, which means something that's already been decided. And even justices who disagree with precedent tend to give deference to precedent because they understand that settled law is an important part of the constitutional system, that people need predictability and stability. A number of these conservative justices, other than Chief Justice Roberts, who does not seem to have joined this decision, this draft decision so far, had told the Senate when they were confirmed that they had full respect for precedent. Some of them had told the Senate that they regarded Roe v. Wade as super precedent. There were precedents that rested on Roe v. Wade, and so the Supreme Court had built on its own decisions. And that gave some reason to believe that let me just say, it is incredibly rare in American legal history for the Supreme Court to overturn rulings that have come to be relied on for decades and decades. And there is no precedent that I'm aware of where the Supreme Court has done that to roll back rights. They have done that to overturn decisions, for example, that upheld segregation. So the Supreme Court has overturned longstanding precedent to advance progress, to advance personal liberty. This is a way of rolling back liberty. Now, of course, abortion is a very unusual situation. Jessica alluded to the idea that the draft might have implications for other important rights. She mentioned same-sex marriage. There's also the question of contraception. Availability of contraception was not always legally protected under the Constitution recognized by the Supreme Court. And the court recognized that under the same reasoning, the 14th Amendment, supposed right to privacy, which is not mentioned explicitly in the Constitution, but is sort of implied. So there's a lot of concern that all sorts of personal liberties could be scaled back as a result of this.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to take a much closer look also at the political ramifications, what this decision, if it happens, because actually we should reaffirm, this is just a draft. There could be change between now and when the court finally rules. But if this decision happens, what does it do to our politics, including our midterm elections come November? In just a moment. The recent leak of a draft Supreme Court decision invalidating the landmark Roe versus Wade ruling that recognized abortion as a constitutional right was a bombshell, the first such leak in the court's nearly 250-year history. But leaks are not new to Washington. I'm not talking about leaks of secrets that various government agencies want to keep forever, such as the Pentagon Papers. But this includes leaks of important documents that would have eventually come to light anyway. The most famous of these leaks in our history goes back to 1848, the leak of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the agreement that would conclude the 2-year Mexican-American War. Its leak to a reporter with the New York Herald infuriated the United States Senate, which had the reporter called in for questioning. The Irish-born journalist refused to disclose his source, saying only that the informant in question was not himself a member of the Senate. Well, that didn't satisfy the senators, who kept the reporter under effective house arrest inside the Capitol building for a whole month. The reporter didn't crack, and he was eventually released. And 10 years later, he was given a handsome political appointment by then President James Buchanan, which was evidence suggesting that the leak itself came from Buchanan, who was Secretary of State at the time of the treaty. Controlling the flow of information then and now is part of the Washington game. Again, my guests today include Todd Gilman. Todd is Washington bureau chief of the Dallas Morning News, one of America's finest regional newspapers. In addition to being an astute observer of American politics and a longtime panelist on our show, he serves on the board of the White House Correspondents Association. Also joining us is Jessica Taylor. Jessica is the Senate and Governors editor for the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, and she is senior author of the 2022 edition of the Almanac of American Politics. Previously, she was a political reporter for National Public Radio and NBC News. All right, let's assume for a moment, Jessica, that this is indeed the decision of the court. What happens the next morning? Is abortion illegal throughout America? Are there any national laws which would then govern abortion in our country?
Well, there are no national laws, and essentially the draft as written would send the decision back to the states. So this is sort of the originalist perspective that states should be left to decide these things.
Todd, you cover the White House. Does the president have any powers beyond the bully pulpit to address what, for his constituency, I assume is a very serious assault on their sense of right and justice?
Reporters have been asking the White House press secretary for weeks and weeks since the leak of this draft opinion from the Supreme Court what the White House can do, what the president will do, and they talk about wanting to do something, but they have yet to really cough up any specifics. The president's authority in this area is minimal. There might be some things that he could do through executive order to try to reduce some of the legal impediments for people crossing state lines. We haven't mentioned, but more than half of abortions in this country are actually performed with medication. They're not procedure. They're not a surgery of any kind because they're done so early. It's safer. The medicines have gotten easier. There might be some executive actions that the president can take to ensure the availability of those drugs. Even, let's say, even if Texas outlaws those drugs, interstate commerce is a federal authority, and he might be able to ensure that you can get these drugs by mail order. Roe v. Wade came down when I was 7 years old. My entire professional life, abortion has been an animating issue for conservatives, people who wanted to get rid of Roe. And it's always been talked about by liberals, by Democrats, but it's never been like the single issue. It's very hard to find single issue pro-abortion rights voters. That might change if, as we think happens, if this right is overturned now, but it won't happen in time for this election. And really, it seems very likely that if Roe is overturned, it animates both sides pretty much equally, because conservatives, Republicans will be able to say, rah, rah, look at what we did. Trump installed all of these conservative justices. We got what we wanted. We're doing the right thing. This is great. And so to the extent that it riles up liberals who want to restore abortion rights, it also encourages conservatives who are so happy that those are gone.
So if I understand what both of you are saying, regardless of what the Supreme Court decides, this issue is not disappearing from American politics. Is that fair to say?
Yes. I mean, it's always been a political issue lingering, but it's just how much does it matter in voters' minds? I think Todd's right. I feel like, getting closer to election day, they're running out of time.
Okay. On that note, we're going to bring it to a close. Todd Gilman, Jessica Taylor, thank you for helping to explain this very difficult issue to our viewers abroad. Thank you for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. Could Ukraine actually win? In February, when Russia launched its massive and unprovoked invasion of its democratically governed neighbor, the question was preposterous. Far more common was the parlor game of guessing how long the brave, valiant Ukrainians could hold out. After all, they weren't facing some second-rate power. They were attacked by the great Russian bear, whose threatening image sent a generation of school children scurrying under desks during the Cold War, a colossus that kept Eastern Europe under its thumb for decades. To be sure, it may have lost a step or two over the last few years, but this was still Russia, a once and potentially future superpower. And Ukraine was, well, just Ukraine, a country that had already lost a chunk of territory in the Crimea without a real fight. Remember, the presumption at the highest levels of the American government was that Ukraine would suffer swift defeat. It was in response to the offer of evacuation that the plucky president of Ukraine uttered his famous line, preferring ammunition to a ride out of the country. Today, 3 months later, the plot has taken a different path. Ukraine has not only repelled the invasion, but it is routing the invaders, reclaiming territory that it lost early in the fighting. British intelligence reports that fully 1/3 of Russia's original invading force is dead or injured. Refugees are beginning to return to Kyiv. Buses are running again in Kharkiv. With the vital resupply of its armed forces by friends in Europe and America, the Ukrainians are pulling off the near impossible. To be sure, the outcome is not yet clear. Parts of Ukraine have been decimated, and other parts, like Mariupol, still face horrible circumstances. The Russians could mount a new offensive, doubling down on early losses to prevent further embarrassment and perhaps ultimate defeat. Moscow could even resort to more horrible weapons, such as poison gas, or even biological or nuclear weapons, to turn the tide of war. Or faced with the prospect of an enlarging NATO as one response to its invasion of Ukraine, Putin may decide to turn on a small NATO country, perhaps in the Baltics, to test whether the alliance really has the stomach for a fight. All those options are real. But in the meantime, let's sit back and recognize that our jaundice, our cynicism, our dismissal of things like honor, courage, and patriotism has its limits, that sometimes ordinary people can still rise to do extraordinary things. Could the prospect of a Ukrainian victory compel Putin to take his own extraordinary measures to prevent abject defeat? It's possible, and we should do everything possible to deter and prevent him from doing the unimaginable. But that fear should not constrain us from our prime goal, helping the Ukrainians fulfill a national destiny of independence and sovereignty, whose pursuit at such a high price we can only admire. They have restored meaning to honor, courage, and patriotism in a way that elevates us all. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص حول تأثير التضخم على الاقتصاد العالمي، تواصلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @Rob Satloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.